Thank you guys for joining us for another great event. And so today we're going to be hearing from an outstanding speaker. Dr. Katrina Caldwell has over 20 years of experience in higher education and has spent a majority of that time working on initiatives that increase and access opportunities for students. In her most previous role as the Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs, she oversaw the development of programs that reflected the university's commitment to the recruitment, persistence, retention, and graduation of diverse students. Dr. Caldwell has taught courses in multi-ethnic culture, literature, African American history and literature, feminist literature, and peace and social justice. She received her bachelor's degree in English literature from Spelman College and her master's and doctorate in English literature from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katrina Caldwell.
Am I on? Am I hot? So thank you so much for this opportunity. I've been in Oxford for the last 3 months since January 3rd and had a great opportunity to take on this role and to be asked at the beginning of this experience to participate in a wonderful event like this event. It's really a pleasure. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I want to talk, it's not on. I didn't think so. Okay. Is that better? Okay. It didn't sound like it was on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about an aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion that is often forgotten about, but I think it highlights the work that you all are doing for this particular event. And that's this ideal of self-awareness. We all have personal narratives. One of the reasons why I was drawn to literature in terms of the fields of study that I wanted to pursue was my love for books. I am an introvert. I am that person who likes to go in a room by myself, spend time with myself. I do a lot of internal talking, and sometimes I forget I'm talking because I have these characters. I don't have different personalities, but I do have different people who come out when I'm having these conversations. And I choose to have those conversations because it is sometimes challenging for me to be in a room with lots of people when the expectation is to engage. And I can imagine what that feels like for you when you're in diverse environments. That many of you have the same experiences that I have when I've had a long day and now I need to go network in a room full of large people. My heart beats fast. I start sweating. I get really nervous. I think I'm going to say the wrong thing. I feel like that I don't know enough about myself or enough about topics that I can share with people that will be interesting and engaging. I don't think people will laugh at my jokes or all those kinds of things. And so I have this anxiety about engaging across difference. But what I have learned is that understanding my own personal narrative and the power of my own story emboldens me in those moments. So I would encourage you, as you're thinking about all of this, as you're thinking about the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, that you start to think about your own personal narrative and the impact that that has on your understanding of others and the world. So the story of me. So that little girl on the right-hand side, the screen is me. Growing up, that's a version of me that I remember being a pretty happy kid growing up in Memphis, Tennessee. And I grew up in the 1970s. And for many of you who know the history of our country, and particularly the history of the South, the 1960s into the 1970s was the tail end of what we traditionally called the civil rights movement. Even though I argue there are multiple civil rights movements that have happened over our history, that's one that many of you in your history may be aware of. So I grew up in 1970 in Tennessee, in Memphis, Tennessee, and I knew certain things about the area. I knew about the blues, right? I grew up listening to it in my home. I grew up going to places where blues was played. I also knew about this guy. Who knows who this is? Elvis Presley. right? Mr. Presley. I grew up knowing about him. I lived very close to Elvis Presley Boulevard. I'd often have to pass it every day whenever we would go downtown or to my school. So I had a sense of that history. I actually visited the mansion and stood by the airplane, and I had that experience growing up. But there were experiences that I didn't have. There were stories that I didn't know. For instance, I didn't know about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't know about him until I actually graduated from high school and went to college and was sitting in a classroom, and someone was talking about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And they were talking about the fact that he had been assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And you can imagine a person who'd grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, hearing that for the very first time. 18 years of my life, I hadn't heard that narrative. I also didn't know anything about the neighborhood that I grew up in. So I grew up in Orange Mound, and Orange Mound is one of the first, it actually is the first community built by and for African Americans in this country. And so I grew up in this neighborhood as a kid who felt pretty safe, going from home to school to church without any real idea about the history. And a large part of that was because people were afraid to tell those stories. That people felt like they could protect us from our past if we didn't know what that past was. I grew up in Dunbar Elementary School, which was one of the last schools that was desegregated in Memphis, Tennessee. Many of you know Melrose High School, so Dunbar is in that same neighborhood. So that was the history that I had growing up that I didn't know about. So I started to ask questions. So this ideal about understanding one's story, knowing my own story, I encourage you to start thinking about once upon a time, I what? Once upon a time, I as a young X grew up in Y and I experienced Z. How do you start cultivating an understanding of where you came from? How do you go back and do an archaeology of your own beginning? How do you understand the stories that inform your life? How do you understand the context that shaped who you are? It's powerful because in order to do diversity and equity work, there's 6 stages. The 6 stages are important to understand because they build upon each other. So the first stage is self-awareness. The second stage is learning about others. The third stage is understanding society inequities. The fourth stage is understanding the idea that you can be in diverse contexts with diverse people and still be able to engage. And the final stage is then you go out and do diversity work. We have oftentimes people who get frustrated about diversity and equity work. And when I talk to individuals and they say, we're not making a difference, we're not moving a system forward, we're not having the impact that we think we ought to have in this particular situation. And I'll ask them, what stage are you at? So you've decided that you want to engage in a conversation about an issue that's happening in your world or on your campus or in your life. And you've decided to attack that with the individuals who are in your community or in your group. But you're starting at stage 3, which is you may have diverse people and they may come from diverse environments, but you haven't spent the time understanding yourself, right? So you wonder why there's friction in the group. Why don't we get along, right? Why, even if we have the same cause and we have the same idea and we're moving in the same direction, we can't seem to have success? Well, it's because you also haven't learned about each other, which is stage 2, which means you're not talking to one another about how you see the particular issue. You're not talking to each other about your different identities and how those identities engage one another. So, this clip, who knows this story? What story is this? Yes, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. What are other stories we grew up on reading when we were coming up? Three Little Pigs, Little Red Riding Hood. Who? Oh, Jack and Jill. Who? Mother Goose, yes. What did all of those stories teach us? Give me some lessons that we learned from those stories. What did we learn from Jack and Jill? Who knows Jack and Jill? Who can say it? Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling. What do we learn from that? You go down together? Jax will take Jill's down every time. What is the other nursery rhyme? What else did we learn coming up? So we learned Mother Goose, right? We learned Little Red Riding Hood. All of those stories we learned to teach us lessons, right? The shared myths in our cultures that were passed down to us from generation to generation. Sadly, many of us pass those down without understanding not only the context of the story, but also the lessons and the implications of the lessons on the individuals that they share them with. So we always, when we think about these narratives, we also need to think about this word and its perspective. And what that basically means is, with all of these ideas, these narratives, these myths, these belief systems that we've developed through stories, they don't always translate to everyone. Everyone doesn't hear Jack and Jill and think the same thing. The implications of that particular story change based on your history and your context. So who you are has a lot to do with how you understand Jack and Jill or other nursery rhymes. So if we looked at before this perspective, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and now we move to this perspective of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? So we've moved from a story of what? A young lady who feels terrorized by these three bears who've come in and scared her to death. We moved to another perspective of the fact that she broke into their home. She ate their food, she broke their chairs, she slept in their beds, right? That perspective of that particular story changes based on your context, right? Understanding those things in terms of individuality, understanding those things in terms of privacy and space, and on and on and on. Finally, who knows this story? Yes. So if we look at it from this perspective, what do we see? What words come to mind? True love's kiss, passion, right? What else? Sorry. Adoration, yes, thank you. What else? Oh, it went off? Okay. Romance, absolutely. So now we go to this version. Don't worry, I will not do anything inappropriate without your permission. It's important to me that I'm not overstepping any boundaries you may have, right? Now, this is not making fun of or light of his intent, but what it is talking about is this idea that our perception or perspective of a particular story is informed by our context, by our history, by who we are. So, talk to you a little bit in the language in which you are familiar. I hate Twitter, by the way. And it's probably because I'm no good at it. But these are some of the examples of what stories can provide for us. Our stories are reflections of the complex nature of our intersecting identities. What I mean by that is that we all have multiple identities that are not popping up on the screen for some reason. So imagine this has race, has representation, has orientation, has gender, has socioeconomic. So you think about all the ways in which we understand identity, right? And these are our toolkits that we use every day to engage the world. So the identities that I hold are identities that help me understand the world around me. They help me understand my relationships to others, and they help me understand how I can see social inequities in our world. And then the intersection of those is extremely important. So So we're going to do a little exercise. We're going to stand up and we're going to talk to one another. We're going to try to find, with someone we don't know, 2 things that we have that are different. 2 things that about us are different from the person who's next to us. Let's stand up. You can't find anyone? Hi.
So 2 things that are different?
Yes. Okay, let's come back. Let's come back. So I'm going to ask you if I could just get 2 groups who are willing to share out 2 things that are different. 2 differences that they have. Get 2 groups of pairs. Okay, go ahead.
First, I got his name wrong. And we're different genders and different races.
Very good. Thank you. Can I have another group? Stand up, tell differences. Let's focus, for this group, let's talk about differences we can't necessarily see. Differences, yes. Yes.
He has worked outside of Mississippi, and I have not.
Okay.
And he is in the mathematics area, and I'm in the MEek area.
Okay, good. Thank you. Oh. Okay, now, so we've done 2 differences. Let's do 2 similarities, things that are the same. Go back to that same person and find out 2 things that are the same. 2 things that are the same. Yes, exactly. Come back. Okay, can I have 2 different groups to share similarities? Yes.
We both have a regional background, and we were both born in Tennessee and have relatives in Tupelo.
Great. Thank you. Yes. One more group? Yes. Okay. Thank you. So tell me from that experience, which of those experiences was more difficult than the other? Which experience was more difficult? Finding out differences or finding out similarities? Anybody? Differences for you? What did it feel like to search for differences?
It was almost like we were trying to think too hard on it, honestly. I mean, we looked up, we happened to be from the same area, but I also had some more similarities than we expected.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I mean, to be frank, as a white man, I figured I'd have a lot more differences than what we actually found through the first conversation.
Yes, so some of our own assumptions, right, that come in from what we see might frame our differences. Sometimes that means we have to look farther out, we think, to find differences versus the more common things that we do day to day. Okay, good. Who else? Yes. Yes, we did the same thing. Yes. Found similarities when looking for your differences. What did that feel like? Yeah. Yes. Good. One more group. What did it feel like to go through the exercise? Which one was easier, rather?
I'll just say for us, I think the second one was easier because we discovered similarities the first time around.
That's right.
So we kind of already had them for the second go around.
You get a star. Was there a star? Do I have a gold star? Absolutely. The point of the exercise is just that, is that sometimes we want to start immediately with the things that divide us, right? With the things that are different from us than what we can visually see from others, from other individuals. And sometimes when we explore, when we lean into our differences, we find that there actually are more things that we might have in common. And how those commonalities can help us engage in conversations, how those commonalities can help us live in community, how those commonalities can help us actually work together towards shared goals and shared causes. The other things that stories do is stories shape our beliefs, values, ideas, and perceptions of others. I talked about that early in terms of those stories that we're often told. We all walk around with frames on. We have lenses through which we understand the world. So based on what our frames are, that's going to inform the lenses. So our ideas of the world are those frames that we have. When we look through the lens and we see a particular person or situation or circumstance or context, we're going to read it through those particular frames. So I'll ask this question. You see these beautiful kids, right? I'll ask you to stand up if the kid on the right is a cisgender male. If the kid on the right is a cisgender male, if you stand up. Someone asked what's cisgender. Does anyone know what that term means? Yes. Yes, the gender that you were born with, correct. Cisgender male. All right, cisgender female, stand up. Kid on the right. Don't, neither? Okay. Is the baby on the right a cisgender female? Stand up. Okay, I have some people who are not standing. Why are you not standing? Right. We still can't tell. Why are we standing? Because the baby has on pink, right? So our lens and our frames, we see pink, we automatically think cisgender girl. We already make the assumption, we're socialized to believe that what we see, those clues that we have based on the stories we've been told and our engagement with the world tells us about the person, informs us about that person. It's what happens when we have cognitive dissonance, which is a term that means when you go into an experience that uncovers, right, challenges your belief system. And often for many of us, college classrooms provide this cognitive dissonance. Residence hall living provides cognitive dissonance because we have a particular perception about the world and then we have an experience with someone who doesn't match that perception, right? So what happens? We have two conflicting beliefs, what I've always been told, what my family believes, what I learned in church, what I learned by my friends, what I learned in my neighborhood, And now when I go to college, what I experience in the real world, what I experience for myself, who I engage with when I come here, the kinds of friendships I'm able to develop beyond what I was taught. Those particular things come to a head, and we have to decide whether or not we're going to resolve them and create solidarity, or whether we're going to resist them, right? Because it can be painful to be told one particular thing or viewpoint and then experience something that's contradictory and not quite know what to do with that information. So, what happens? It actually impacts our brain, right? So we talked earlier about biases. Biases are actually, have been studied by neurologists to say we actually have a physical reaction to things that we have bias against. So the idea that I talked about before, that when I walk into a room and I'm around a group of people and my heart starts beating real fast and my palms start sweating and I feel uncomfortable, those are all physiological responses to feeling uncomfortable in a situation. And our bias does that as well. It's our fear, it's our flight response happens when we engage in differences that don't make us feel comfortable. So we're going to do an exercise to talk about, just kind of show you how this works. So stand up with me. You're going to say this word really, really loudly. And as I raise my hands, you're going to say it louder and louder, okay? And as I get to the end, I'm going to ask you a question. And when I ask you the question, first person who gives me the right answer gets a t-shirt. We're giving away t-shirts, right? So, you ready? You see this word? All right, let's go. Shop, 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 shop. What do you do at the green light? Stop. What do you do at a green light? Stop. Raise your hand if you said go. How many of you got go, right? Okay. All right. Want to do it one more time? This time you're going to get me, right? All right, ready? Let's do this word. How? You ready? How? 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 Where do eggs come from? You got me. Some people still say cow. Right. So you can have a seat. Thank you. Right. So I call this exercise brains on bias. Right? So this ideal of that consistent drumbeat of an experience or a story that we're told. That is a story that's reinforced in our primary lives, meaning our family and community. Then that story is built on when we go to school and church and our secondary socialization. And then finally in our tertiary socialization, we're rewarded when we actually practice those same beliefs, right? And when we decide to challenge those same beliefs, then we lose something, right? Either we lose relationship, or we actually lose compensation, or we lose things that we value when we decide to move beyond our bias. And that's why it is often difficult for people to break out of those belief systems, because it is that constant drumbeat that makes us feel comfortable, that gets us in this rhythm, and then there's that disruption that happens, right? And our unconscious takes over and answers the question, even after the second time when you know that it's going to be a trick question. Our unconscious still does what it's supposed to do. And it's supposed to jump right in there when we feel like we're being threatened or challenged in some way. So bias. Okay, I'm doing something here. All right, our stories help us transmit our histories. What are you made of? The importance of knowing your family history. So I'm not sure the videos are going to work. We weren't sure, so we'll see. If they do, if they don't, we'll be okay. Okay, doesn't look like it's going to work. That's okay. So this video, how many of you seen this commercial? No one? Okay. So this is a commercial of a young lady who gets a wedding invitation. And she gets a wedding invitation, she goes to the wedding, and she finds out that someone at the wedding is a cousin of hers, long-lost cousin that she's never met. And then we go to a scene where she decides not to go to the wedding, and so she never meets the cousin, and they show us the night she's in the nightclub. She's dancing, bopping around, and guess what happens? She sees this guy across the room, and guess who it is? Her cousin. But since she didn't go to the wedding, she doesn't know. So this is a Priceline commercial, basically saying, if you don't take advantage of this particular situation, you never know. Families are important, right? So this idea that our families shape us, that our families are our origin story, where we came from, and that our families set the context for our understanding about not only ourselves, but the world, and it's so important that we understand that context of that family. Our stories can also empower us. And this is another clip that probably won't go as well. But this is a South African feminist scholar, activist, who's talking about the first time she discovered African literature. And though she had been reading British literature and loved it, loved British literature, loved American literature, it wasn't until the first time that she engaged in African literature. She had a conversation with a teacher who told her about Chinua Achebe. And she read his work. And what she says in this clip is, I found myself. I discovered that there was not a single story. When we talk about things like stereotypes and bias, one of the dangers, and there are many, is that what stereotypes do is they restrict us to a single story. There's only one way to understand our identity when people use stereotypes against us. And so we're always either trying to disprove it or succumb to it because it seems so powerful that we might as well just be the thing that people assume that we are. Our stories can also divide us. And we spend a lot of time talking about the divisions in our culture and how our stories, because we're different, we're so different, we can't find ways for us to connect. But these divisions are becoming deeper. They're becoming more polarizing. And in my opinion, they're becoming more dangerous. And for someone as old as I am, I'm counting on this next generation to kind of gap this, to change this divide, to rebuild, right? You are less, I think we talked about that this morning, you are farther away from the dissension and the disease and the damage that was created around cultural identity and difference than the generation before you, the generation next, and the generation next. And every generation has the promise of trying to bridge this gap. You all have the tools to do it. You have the intellect and talent to do it. All you have to do is show the will to do it, to figure out a way to bridge this difference, to figure out a way so that our differences are our strengths and our commonalities keep bringing us back to that point, right? Our stories can also connect us, right? We talked about the stories that you were told, the nursery rhymes that you were told. Many of us across difference were told similar stories when we were coming up. But we also have different connections every day on which we can build and become stronger. So we don't want to miss those connections. And we miss those connections often by refusing to engage with one another. And it's important that we are as excited about engaging across difference as we are when we engage with people who are like us, right? I know how I feel when I get excited in a room full of people and I see someone I know and I can go and spend that hour next to them. Where they go, I go, right? They move, they know everybody, now I know everybody. That feels really comfortable for me to engage with that person. But what I'm asking us to do is step away from what's familiar and find someone and say, I know nothing about this person, but by the time I leave today, I'm gonna know something. I'm gonna find a way to bridge a gap because that might be the next person who's the COO of my company. or I might work with them to build a new brand, or we may go on an internship and change the world, right? We're the next individuals who are going to make a difference. But because we weren't willing to have those conversations across difference, that never happened. Our stories reflect the power of diversity. So employers in 2013, and this study happens every 3 years, did a study that talked about the qualities that they're looking for from college graduates. And in addition to being having strength in your content area, as you can tell by this, they're also looking for individuals who understand how to problem solve in diverse settings. Pushing that button. Problem solve in problem solve in diverse settings, right there. They're also looking for individuals who have ethical issues, public debates important in their field, civic knowledge, skills, and judgment essential for contributing to the community and to our democratic society, and ethical decision making. Some of those things that we don't think about when we're talking about preparing for the world outside of college. But employees are looking for it. We all face decisions that we have to make. The more diverse and engaged we are, when decisions that are made that are outside of our expectations in terms of social equity, when individuals in our community are mistreated, when individuals in our community face potential threats to their safety and their identity, that oftentimes is those individuals who have the highest skill level who are the ones that call us to consciousness. So when certain things happen, for instance, in this case, the tech companies stood up and they stood in defense of those individuals in North Carolina who were going to be harmed by this law. And as a result of that, the community listened. And so this is what I'm calling us to do, not necessarily to pick a law or an idea or necessarily to pick a battle. I'm asking you to take a stand on the things that we know will hurt other individuals in our community and our society. But the only way we can get invested in doing that is that we understand our stories as well as others. Finally, our stories can have alternate endings. Who knows this story? Yes? Thelma and Louise. So at the end of Thelma and Louise, there was these test groups where they tried to decide whether or not they were going to let Thelma and Louise drive off the cliff, and then the story would fade away, and we know what was going to happen. Or they stopped short of the drop-off, and this is the version that they chose. And there was a lot of conversation about Thelma and Louise being rebels and renegades, and that there's cost, and we need to understand the cost and consequence. But there were other people who talked about their bravery deserved for them to fly forever. And there were images that people were saying that car never comes down, that the dreams and the ideas and the passion that they showed for what they believed in kept that car going and going and going in people's imagination, right? Because it's pointed upwards, not quite down. But this idea that Thelma and Louise have an alternate ending, we can as well. Where our stories start, the context of our lives, right? Our beginnings don't shape necessarily where we're going and who we plan to be. It just tells us where we come from, and it might account for some small portion of who we are. So write your own story. Now is the time. Not only write the story, your origin story, but also write the story of your life moving forward and how you want to engage around these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, the contributions that you can give to this work. Thank you. So I'm going to open it up for questions real quick. If there's just questions that you have, doesn't necessarily have to be about presentation. Yes?
What barriers to diversity do you think that, so specifically with our campaign and the role that you've served in, since you've been here since January, what have you seen thus far that this campaign specifically the campus needs to address.
I was very excited that MEek School decided to start with me, because I think so many times when we think about diversity, it's about you, right? And it's about other people, and it's about our engagement with other people. I think it's very important for us to have conversations about self. And I've seen that serve powerful. I teach classes ever so often. At the beginning of each class, I do this activity called the name game. Some people have heard this, where you ask people to talk about the significance of their name. And one, it helps me because I have a horrible memory with names. But two, it's a name story that starts a conversation where people can start to identify across difference. And so I think that's the important thing that I see. We need to start being willing to have conversations, not start being willing to, but highlight those opportunities where students can go and talk about their own identity, because they're here, and I've seen them in the 3 months that I've been here. How do we get them out so that the whole campus can see it and be a part of that conversation? So there's so much more that we can do once we know that we're all challenged by diversity, equity, and inclusion in different ways. But I think people are intimidated to even start those conversations because we start with, how am I different from you, right? How are my beliefs different, right? And I think we need to start with, what are some of the ways that we're the same?